Johnson Cole sat in his expansive study late at night, staring at the flickering flames of the fireplace. His empire was thriving, but his personal life was in shambles. His only son, Christopher, was a walking contradiction to everything Johnson valued: discipline, respect, and responsibility. At 30, Christopher was the epitome of recklessness. He had been through 3 different universities before finally dropping out. He spent his nights in Los Angeles' most exclusive clubs, surrounded by fast cars and even faster women. Christopher's Instagram was a gallery of indulgence: bottles of champagne, parties on yachts, and a different woman on his arm every week. But it wasn't just his lifestyle that troubled Johnson. Christopher's arrogance and disdain for others, especially those who worked under him, had begun to affect the family business. Loretta Smith had been Johnson's secretary for 5 years. Intelligent and sharp-tongued, she had proven herself indispensable. She was respected by all except Christopher. The clashes between them had become infamous in the office. "Loretta, can you stop breathing down my neck? I don't need you hovering over me," Christopher snapped one afternoon, throwing a stack of files on her desk. Loretta raised an eyebrow. "Hovering? If I weren't here to clean up your mess, the company would have collapsed by now. Maybe if you focused on work instead of your next conquest, we'd actually get things done." Her words were like pouring gasoline on fire. Christopher stormed out, muttering under his breath. Johnson had witnessed one too many of their fiery exchanges. It was exhausting, yet it confirmed what he suspected. Loretta was the only person unafraid to challenge Christopher. At home, Christopher's behavior was even worse. He treated the family mansion like a bachelor pad, often bringing women home without a care. One evening, Loretta was leaving after a late-night meeting with Johnson when she saw a woman, barely dressed, stumbling into the house. "Excuse me," Loretta said, her voice firm. "This is not a hotel." The woman, startled, turned to Christopher, who appeared moments later, shirtless and grinning. "Loretta, you're still here?" he said mockingly. "Why don't you relax for once? Maybe you'd be less uptight if you had some fun." "Fun?" Loretta shot back, her eyes blazing. "This is your father's house, not your personal playground. Show some respect." Christopher laughed. "Respect? You're just his secretary. Don't act like you're part of this family." Loretta stormed out, furious, while Johnson, who had overheard the argument from his study, felt a pang of guilt. He had to fix this. 1 week later, Johnson invited Loretta to lunch at a quiet, upscale restaurant. She was surprised. He rarely made time for anything outside work. "Loretta," Johnson began after they ordered, "you've been a great support to me over the years. I trust you more than anyone else." "Thank you, sir," Loretta replied cautiously. "What's on your mind?" Johnson sighed heavily. "It's Christopher. He's spiraling out of control. I've tried everything to reach him, but nothing works. He needs someone strong, someone who can ground him, someone like you." Loretta froze. "I don't understand. What exactly are you asking me to do?" "I want you to be a mother figure to him," Johnson said, choosing his words carefully. "Help him calm down, see sense, guide him." Loretta frowned. "Sir, with all due respect, Christopher doesn't even respect me at work. How am I supposed to help him in his personal life?" "You've already been doing it, whether you realize it or not," Johnson said. "I've watched how you stand up to him, how you hold him accountable. That's what he needs, Loretta. Someone who won't let him get away with his nonsense." Loretta shook her head. "This sounds impossible. I'm not his family." "You could be," Johnson interrupted, his tone unreadable. "Think about it." Loretta's breath caught. She stared at him, unsure if she had misheard. "What are you saying?" Johnson leaned forward. "I want us to get married." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Loretta was stunned. "Sir, I can't marry you. That's absurd." "It's not absurd," Johnson replied calmly. "I'm not asking for love. This isn't about romance. It's about Christopher. If he sees you as family, he'll have no choice but to listen to you." Loretta's shock turned to anger. "You're asking me to ruin my life for your son?" "No, sir. I can't." "I'm not asking you to ruin your life. Johnson said firmly. "I'm offering you a chance to make a difference. This is bigger than either of us. Please, Loretta, think about it." Loretta left the restaurant in a daze, but the seed had been planted. Over the following weeks, Johnson persisted, reassuring her of his intentions and promising that she would never be forced into anything she didn't want. Finally, worn down and moved by Johnson's desperation, she agreed, on one condition. "Christopher must never feel like I'm replacing his mother," she said, "and you have to promise that one day he'll know the truth." "I promise," Johnson said solemnly. The quiet wedding took place at Johnson's private estate, with only a handful of close associates present. Christopher didn't bother attending. When he learned of the marriage, he was livid. "How could you marry her?" he yelled at his father during a heated confrontation. "She's just your secretary. This is a joke." "This is my life, Christopher," Johnson replied calmly. "You don't have to like it, but you will respect it." Christopher turned to Loretta, his eyes blazing. "Congratulations, Mrs. Cole. I hope you enjoy your new position." Loretta met his glare with calm resolve. "Thank you, Christopher. I intend to." The battle lines were drawn, and the war had just begun. The marriage between Johnson Cole and Loretta Smith sent ripples of shock through the Cole mansion. Christopher couldn't believe it. His father, the powerful billionaire CEO, had married his secretary. To Christopher, it was the ultimate betrayal. And Loretta? She was no stranger to his disdain, but now that she was officially Mrs. Cole, Christopher made it his personal mission to make her regret ever stepping foot in their home. From the very first day after the wedding, the tension in the house was palpable. One morning, as Loretta prepared breakfast in the grand kitchen, Christopher barged in wearing nothing but pajama pants. His hair was disheveled, and he reeked of alcohol from the night before. "Morning," he grunted, opening the fridge and pulling out a bottle of juice. "Morning," Loretta replied coolly, not looking up from the eggs she was frying. As Christopher took a swig straight from the bottle, Loretta's patience snapped. "Use a glass, Christopher. You're not a child." Christopher turned, smirking. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize this was your kitchen now, too." "It's not about ownership. It's about hygiene," Loretta shot back, turning off the stove and folding her arms. "You may not respect yourself, but at least respect the people who live here." Christopher's smirk turned into a glare. "Look, just because you're my father's wife now doesn't mean you can boss me around. You're still just his secretary in my eyes." "And you're still a spoiled, entitled brat in mine," Loretta retorted. The argument escalated, with voices rising and insults flying. Johnson walked into the kitchen midway, his stern expression silencing them instantly. "If you two are going to act like children, I'll treat you like children," he said coldly. "Enough of this nonsense." Christopher stormed out, muttering under his breath while Loretta sighed in frustration. Meals became battlegrounds. At dinner, Christopher would deliberately ignore Loretta, addressing his father with cutting remarks. "So, Dad, when are you going to hire a real wife?" he said one evening, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Johnson's eyes narrowed. "Enough, Christopher." But Loretta refused to stay silent. "I'm right here, you know," she said, calmly slicing her steak. "You don't have to talk about me like I'm invisible." "Oh, I wasn't talking about you," Christopher replied with a fake smile. "I was talking about whoever replaces you after this little arrangement falls apart." Loretta clenched her jaw, but refused to rise to his bait. "It's funny," she said, setting her knife and fork down. "You talk so much about replacing me, yet you're the one who's been replaced. Your father doesn't trust you to run the company, and he certainly doesn't trust you to run your life." The room fell silent. Christopher's face darkened as he pushed his plate aside and stormed out. The tension hit a boiling point one night when Christopher returned home from a party with two women on his arm. They were loud, giggling, and barely dressed. Loretta, who had been reading in the living room, looked up in disbelief. "You can't be serious." Christopher smirked. "Relax, Mrs. Cole. We'll be out of your hair by morning." Not in this house, you won't, Loretta said, standing up. One of the women rolled her eyes. Who's this, your nanny? Before Christopher could respond, Loretta stepped forward. I'm the woman who pays the staff who clean the messes you'll leave behind. So unless you want me to call security, I suggest you leave now. The women hesitated, but Christopher laughed. Oh, come on, Loretta, don't be such a killer of joy. They're not hurting anyone. Loretta wasn't having it. She marched over to the front door, opened it wide, and gestured outside. Out, now! The women exchanged awkward glances before gathering their things and leaving. Once they were gone, Christopher turned to Loretta, furious. Who do you think you are? He yelled. Someone who refuses to let you turn this house into a brothel, Loretta shot back. You're nothing but a gold digger, Christopher snarled. You don't belong here, and you never will. Loretta's eyes flashed with anger. And you're nothing but a lost boy hiding behind your father's money. Grow up, Christopher. The argument lasted well into the night, with Johnson finally intervening and threatening to throw them both out if they didn't stop. The chaos at home spilled into the office. Johnson, in an attempt to force them to work together, assigned them to the same project. It was a disaster. During one meeting, Christopher dismissed Loretta's suggestions outright. We don't need to waste time on her ideas. They're useless. Loretta didn't miss a beat. Funny, coming from someone whose only contributions are his last name. The tension in the room was unbearable as the other employees tried to focus on their work. Johnson, watching from his office, shook his head. The animosity between Christopher and Loretta was undeniable, but beneath the surface, something else was brewing. The days turned into weeks, and the war between Loretta and Christopher showed no signs of easing. If anything, their animosity seemed to intensify. Johnson watched from the sidelines, silently hopeful that the friction between them would ignite a deeper understanding. But for now, their interactions were marked by chaos, resentment, and moments that left the house on edge. One evening, Christopher sprawled across the plush leather sofa in the sitting room, flicking through channels on the massive flat-screen TV. Loud music blared from his wireless speaker, filling the house with a thumping beat. Loretta walked in, her arms full of files she intended to review for the following day's board meeting. She stopped short, staring at Christopher in disbelief. Christopher, can you lower the volume? I'm trying to prepare for tomorrow, she said, her tone sharp. Christopher didn't even glance her way. Not my problem, Mrs. Cole. Loretta's temper flared. She marched over to the speaker and switched it off. Hey! Christopher shot up, glaring at her. What the hell is your problem? My problem, Loretta snapped, is that you act like a spoiled child who thinks the world revolves around him. Newsflash, it doesn't. Christopher stepped closer, his jaw tightening. Don't think for a second you can walk in here and start dictating how I live my life. And don't think for a second that I'll let you ruin everything your father has worked for, Loretta fired back. The argument escalated until Johnson appeared in the doorway. Enough! He thundered, his voice echoing through the room. Both Christopher and Loretta fell silent, glaring at each other as Johnson looked between them. If you two can't coexist peacefully, I'll send both of you out of this house. Is that clear? Neither dared to argue further, but as Loretta walked away, she could feel Christopher's eyes burning into her back. The next day, things only got worse. Johnson had assigned Christopher and Loretta to oversee the opening of a new branch in another city, and they had to share a car to get there. The drive started in tense silence, with Loretta scrolling through her phone while Christopher fiddled with the radio. Can you stop that? Loretta finally said, her annoyance evident. Stop what? Christopher asked innocently, turning the volume up. You know what? She snapped. Christopher smirked. Relax, Loretta. Life's too short to be this uptight. Uptight? Loretta scoffed. I'm trying to keep this business afloat while you treat it like a playground. The argument continued until Christopher, distracted by their exchange, nearly missed a turn. Loretta gasped, gripping the dashboard. Are you trying to kill us? She yelled. Maybe if you stopped nagging, I could focus on driving, Christopher retorted. When they finally arrived at the branch, the staff greeted them with nervous smiles, clearly sensing the tension. As they walked into the building, Christopher muttered, "Next time, I'm driving alone." "Trust me, the feeling is mutual," Loretta shot back. That evening, Johnson invited both of them to dinner, hoping to create an opportunity for reconciliation. Instead, it became another battlefield. The three of them sat at the long dining table, the air heavy with unspoken tension. "So, how was the opening?" Johnson asked, cutting into his steak. "Fine," Christopher said curtly. Loretta raised an eyebrow. "Fine? You nearly ran us off the road." Christopher glared at her. "Maybe if you weren't distracting me?" "That's enough," Johnson interrupted, his patience wearing thin. "You two are adults. Start acting like it." The silence that followed was icy, but Loretta couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. For all his flaws, Christopher's anger seemed rooted in something deeper than just their arguments. Later that night, as Loretta prepared for bed, she heard a knock on her door. Opening it, she found Christopher standing there, his expression unreadable. "What do you want?" she asked warily. Christopher hesitated before speaking. "Look, I get it. You think I'm a failure, that I'm a disappointment to my father." Loretta blinked, caught off guard. "I never said that." "You didn't have to," Christopher said bitterly. "It's written all over your face." Loretta sighed, stepping aside to let him in. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because—" Christopher trailed off, running a hand through his hair. "Because maybe you're right. Maybe I do need to grow up. But that doesn't mean I'll make it easy for you." Loretta smirked. "I wouldn't expect anything less." For the first time, they shared a moment of mutual understanding, brief but significant. Neither of them realized it yet, but the seeds of change had been planted. Despite the fleeting moment of understanding between Loretta and Christopher, the friction between them remained unrelenting. If anything, it seemed to intensify as they were forced to spend more time together. Johnson's insistence on joint projects and frequent family dinners only added fuel to the fire. But beneath their constant battles, something else began to take shape, an unspoken tension that neither of them could fully understand or admit. One morning at the office, Christopher burst into the conference room where Loretta was leading a team meeting. He strode in without knocking, a smug grin on his face. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, not sounding apologetic at all. "But I need those reports you promised yesterday. Or did you forget?" Loretta didn't miss a beat. "I didn't forget. They're on your desk, assuming you bothered to check." The team exchanged awkward glances as the tension crackled in the air. Christopher leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Next time, how about you send me an email instead of making me chase you down? How about you learn to manage your time instead of barging in on other people's meetings?" Loretta shot back. The room went silent and Christopher smirked, clearly enjoying the reaction. "Carry on," he said before strolling out, leaving Loretta fuming. Later that evening, Johnson called for another family dinner, but it quickly devolved into another argument. "Loretta," Christopher began, swirling a glass of wine lazily, "I noticed you're working on the quarterly budgets. Are you sure you can handle that? It's not too complex for you?" Loretta's fork paused midair, her expression icy. Funny, coming from someone who still needs his secretary to explain basic spreadsheets. Johnson sighed deeply, setting down his glass. "Do you two ever stop?" "No," they answered in unison, glaring at each other. "Maybe if Christopher didn't constantly undermine me. Maybe if Loretta didn't act like she knows everything." "That's enough!" Johnson snapped, slamming his hand on the table. "I've had it with both of you. Either you learn to get along, or I'll fire you both from this house and the company. Try me." His words stunned them into silence, but as soon as he left the room, the glares resumed. The next day, Christopher came home with another woman, a tall, glamorous model type. She hung onto his arm, laughing loudly as he led her into the sitting room. Loretta, who had been reviewing documents on the couch, looked up and immediately felt her irritation spike. "Really, Christopher? Again?" she said, standing up. Christopher smirked. "Jealous, Mrs. Cole?" "Hardly," Loretta replied, folding her arms. but I won't let you parade women through this house like it's some kind of nightclub." The woman looked confused. "What's her problem?" "She's just mad because no one's bringing her flowers," Christopher said with a chuckle. Loretta marched up to the woman, her voice firm. "I think it's time for you to leave." "Excuse me?" the woman said, offended. "You heard me," Loretta said, opening the door. "Out now." The woman turned to Christopher, who shrugged. "I told you she's crazy," he said, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, an almost reluctant admiration for Loretta's boldness. As the woman stormed out, Loretta turned to Christopher. "If you're going to act like a child, I'll treat you like one." "Keep pushing me, Loretta," Christopher said, stepping closer, his voice low. "One day you'll regret it." Loretta's eyes widened. "You're willing to throw away everything your father built because you can't handle being an adult." "Stop it!" Johnson yelled, slamming his hand on the desk. "This isn't just about you. It's about the legacy I've spent my life building. And if you can't see that, then maybe I made a mistake trusting either of you." The room went silent, and for the first time, both Christopher and Loretta looked genuinely ashamed. Later that evening, Christopher brought another woman home, a blatant act of defiance after the day's events. Loretta, who had been in the sitting room reviewing documents, felt her patience snap. "This has to stop," she said, standing up as the woman draped herself over Christopher. Christopher smirked, clearly enjoying her reaction. "Jealous again, Loretta?" "Get her out of here," Loretta said firmly. The woman looked confused. "Who does she think she is?" "I'm the one who has to deal with his mess every day," Loretta said, glaring at Christopher, "and I'm not putting up with it anymore." Christopher's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of anger. "You don't get to control my life." "And you don't get to treat this house like a playground," Loretta shot back. The argument grew louder until the woman stormed out, muttering under her breath. "Happy now?" Christopher asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "No," Loretta replied, her voice trembling with frustration. "I'm tired, Christopher. Tired of cleaning up after you. Tired of fighting with you. She stopped, unable to finish her sentence. For the first time, Christopher saw something other than anger in her eyes, something vulnerable, and it unnerved him. That night, Christopher found himself knocking on Loretta's door. When she opened it, her expression was a mix of surprise and irritation. "What now?" she asked, clearly exhausted. Christopher hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I wanted to say I'm sorry, for earlier." Loretta blinked, taken aback. "You're apologizing?" "Don't make it weird," he said with a half smile. She sighed, stepping aside to let him in. "Why are you really here, Christopher?" He hesitated before speaking. "I don't know, I guess I'm just tired too." For the first time, they talked without the usual sarcasm or hostility. Christopher admitted to feeling lost, burdened by the expectations placed on him. Loretta, in turn, confessed how difficult it was to navigate her role in the family. By the time Christopher left, something had shifted between them. Neither could quite explain it, but the walls they had built around themselves were beginning to crack. The next morning, Johnson called them into his study. He looked pale, his usual commanding presence diminished. "I've made a decision," he began, his voice strained. "It's time for me to step back from the company." Christopher and Loretta exchanged shocked looks. "What are you saying, Dad?" Christopher asked. "I'm saying that it's time for you two to take over," Johnson said. "Together." The announcement left them reeling, but there was no time to argue. A storm was brewing within the company, and they would have to face it as a united front, or risk losing everything. The announcement of Johnson's retirement party sent ripples through the company and the family. For years, the CEO had been a towering figure of authority and guidance, and his decision to step down marked the end of an era. The party was grand, a mix of business associates, family friends, and staff, all gathered to celebrate Johnson's legacy. Christopher arrived fashionably late, as always, with a glamorous woman on his arm. Her presence immediately drew attention, and whispers filled the room. Loretta, standing by Johnson's side, felt her stomach tighten at the sight. She forced a smile. trying to focus on her role as the supportive wife, but her eyes kept drifting to Christopher. Loretta looked stunning in a fitted emerald green gown that hugged her figure perfectly, drawing several admiring glances from the guests. Johnson, ever the doting husband in public, stayed close to her, introducing her to various influential guests. Christopher, meanwhile, moved through the crowd with his usual charm, but his focus repeatedly returned to Loretta. He caught her eye more than once, and each glance felt like a spark, igniting something neither of them could control. Loretta tried to focus on Johnson's words as he introduced her to a prominent investor, but her attention kept straying. She watched as Christopher laughed at something his date said, jealousy simmering beneath her composed. Later in the evening, Loretta found herself alone on the balcony, needing a moment to collect herself. She leaned against the railing, taking deep breaths to steady her nerves. "Running away from the crowd?" Christopher's voice broke the silence. She turned to see him standing in the doorway, his tie slightly loosened and a drink in his hand. "Just needed some air," she replied, her voice calm but guarded. Christopher stepped closer, his gaze locked on hers. "You look beautiful tonight," he said, his tone sincere. Loretta's cheeks flushed. "Don't start, Christopher." "I'm not starting anything," he said, setting his drink on the railing. "I'm just saying what's true." The tension between them was palpable. Loretta tried to step away, but Christopher reached out, gently grabbing her wrist. "Why do we keep doing this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I can't stop." Before either of them could think, their lips met in a kiss that was as passionate as it was forbidden. The world around them faded, and for a brief moment nothing else mattered. When they finally broke apart, reality came crashing back. "This can't happen," Loretta said, her voice shaky. "I know," Christopher interrupted, stepping back. "It won't happen again." But the look in his eyes said otherwise. The days following the party were filled with confusion and longing. Christopher, unable to stay under the same roof as Loretta without risking further indiscretions, decided to move into his own apartment. However, their connection only grew stronger. In the days before Christopher officially moved out, their stolen moments became more frequent. A brush of hands in the kitchen, lingering looks in the sitting room, and quiet conversations late at night. The tension between them was electric, and their attempts to suppress it only made it stronger. The office, once a battleground, became a place of subtle intimacy. They would find excuses to work late, sharing quiet dinners in the boardroom. Christopher's usual arrogance softened around Loretta, and she found herself laughing at his jokes more often than she wanted to admit. During lunch one day, Christopher invited Loretta to a quiet restaurant under the guise of discussing a project. The conversation quickly turned personal, and by the end of the meal, they were holding hands across the table. In a rare moment of spontaneity, Christopher convinced Loretta to join him at an amusement park. They laughed like teenagers as they rode roller coasters and played games. The day ended with them sharing a quiet moment on the Ferris wheel, the city lights stretching out beneath them. One evening, Christopher surprised Loretta with tickets to a romantic movie. They sat in the back row, their hands brushing against each other in the dark. By the end of the movie, they were leaning into each other, sharing whispered comments and soft laughter. Driving back from a late meeting, Christopher reached over and intertwined his fingers with Loretta's. The gesture was simple but deeply intimate, leaving both of them feeling vulnerable yet comforted. While Johnson never caught them in the act, he couldn't ignore the changes in their behavior. Loretta's happiness was impossible to miss, and Christopher's attitude had shifted as well. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Johnson turned to Loretta. "You seem lighter these days," he said, his tone curious. Loretta forced a smile, just trying to focus on the positives. Johnson nodded, but remained unconvinced. There was something in the air, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. As the bond between Loretta and Christopher deepened, they both knew they were walking a dangerous line. Their connection, though undeniable, was forbidden, and the consequences of their actions loomed large. The tension in the household had reached new heights. Loretta and Christopher's secret bond, which had been growing stronger by the day, was beginning to affect everything around them. The house was no longer a peaceful sanctuary. Instead, it was charged with unspoken words, stolen glances, and fleeting moments of intense connection. They knew what they were doing was dangerous, but neither could seem to stop themselves. Johnson, though outwardly content in his retirement, could sense that something was off. He had always been keenly aware of the dynamics within his family, and the subtle changes in Loretta and Christopher's behavior did not escape him. There were moments when he would catch them exchanging quiet smiles or notice their sudden silences when he walked into a room. One afternoon, he called Loretta into his study. "Loretta, we need to talk," he said, closing the door behind her. Loretta, who had been trying to maintain a sense of normalcy, felt her heart skip a beat. She sat down across from him, trying to keep her composure. "What is it, Johnson?" she asked, her voice steady. Johnson studied her for a long moment before speaking. "I know you and Christopher have been getting closer lately." Loretta's breath caught in her throat. She fought to keep her expression neutral. "What do you mean?" "I'm not blind, Loretta," he said, his voice soft but firm. "There's a change in the air, the way you two look at each other." He paused, taking a deep breath. "What's going on?" Loretta swallowed hard. She had never imagined that Johnson would notice, much less confront her about it. For a moment she thought about lying, about telling him everything was fine, but something in her chest twisted, and the weight of their secret felt unbearable. "I don't know what you mean," she finally said, but even she didn't believe her own words. Johnson's eyes softened. "Loretta, I've watched you for years. I know you. But something is different now, please. Don't lie to me." Loretta's mind raced, but she couldn't find the words to explain. The truth was too complicated, too dangerous. So she said nothing, allowing the silence to fill the room. Johnson sighed deeply, a mixture of concern and resignation in his eyes. "If this is what I think it is," he trailed off, shaking his head. "Please, don't make a mistake that will destroy everything." Loretta couldn't answer. She simply stood, walked to the door, and left. Later that day, Christopher met Loretta in the garden. They had been avoiding each other all morning, their guilt and confusion thick in the air between them. But the pull between them was too strong to resist for long. Christopher was sitting on the garden bench, staring out into the well-maintained lawn, his fingers nervously tapping against the armrest. When he saw Loretta approaching, he stood up, his eyes locking with hers. "You didn't tell him, did you?" he asked quietly. Loretta shook her head, not trusting her voice to speak. "Good," Christopher replied, his tone more serious than usual. "But Loretta, we can't keep doing this. It's dangerous. For both of us." Loretta nodded, her heart aching. "I know, but I don't know how to stop it." They stood there for a long moment, neither speaking. The weight of their feelings hung in the air, suffocating them both. Finally, Christopher reached out, his hand brushing hers in a gesture of comfort. "We'll figure this out," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The office, once a place of professional collaboration, had become another battleground. The tension between Christopher and Loretta had started to affect their work. Their arguments, though subtle, were increasingly frequent, and their once efficient partnership now felt strained. They exchanged curt words in meetings, their business dealings tainted by the growing emotional turmoil between them. One afternoon, they were called into a strategy meeting to discuss a new partnership proposal. Christopher had been distant all day, and Loretta could feel the coldness in the air between them. "You're not listening, Christopher," Loretta said sharply, her patience wearing thin. "This is not just about you. It's about the company's future." "I know what it's about, Loretta," Christopher replied, his voice clipped. "But maybe you should stop pretending like you're the only one who knows what's best for everyone." The room fell silent. Everyone in the meeting was well aware of the tension between the two, but no one dared to speak up. Loretta clenched her fists, trying to remain calm. "Fine," she said, her voice low but firm. "If you think you can handle it on your own, then go ahead. But don't come crying to me when this falls apart." She stood and walked out of the room, leaving Christopher to stew in his anger. That evening, Loretta found herself sitting alone in the sitting room, her mind racing with the events of the day. She couldn't stop thinking about the way Christopher had looked at her earlier, his eyes filled with frustration and longing. The moments they shared, small touches, quiet glances, were becoming impossible to ignore. She was startled from her thoughts when Christopher entered the room, his face expressionless. He walked past her without a word, but she could feel his presence like a physical weight in the room. "Christopher," she began, her voice softer than before. He stopped, his back to her. "What is it, Loretta?" Loretta stood, her feet moving almost of their own accord as she approached him. She didn't know what she was doing or why she was doing it. All she knew was that the space between them was unbearable. Without a word, she reached out and touched his arm. The electric shock that passed between them was undeniable. "I can't do this anymore," Loretta whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Christopher turned slowly, his eyes dark with desire and frustration. "Then don't," he said, his voice hoarse. In a single movement, he pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply. For a moment, the world fell away. There was no family, no secrets, no consequences, only them. The kiss broke their fragile resolve. They knew they had crossed a line, but in that moment, they couldn't stop themselves. They stood there in the quiet of the living room, the weight of their actions hanging over them like a dark cloud. Christopher pulled away first, his chest heaving. "We're playing with fire, Loretta," he said softly. "I know," she whispered, "but I don't know how to stop." The reality of what they had just done began to sink in. They were walking a dangerous path, and they both knew that sooner or later, their secret would be exposed. But for now, all they could do was wait for the storm to break. The days that followed the kiss in the sitting room were filled with an uncomfortable silence. Both Christopher and Loretta knew they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Their connection had evolved into something undeniable, and no matter how much they tried to suppress it, the bond between them continued to grow stronger. The weight of their secret pressed down on them with each passing moment. They had managed to keep their affair under wraps, but it was only a matter of time before someone would notice. The tension between them was palpable, and even Johnson could sense the unease that lingered in the house. Johnson had always been a man of few words, preferring to observe the dynamics of his family rather than confront them head-on. But over the past few weeks, he had grown increasingly unsettled by the strange behavior he had witnessed between Loretta and Christopher. Their conversations had become more strained, their interactions colder yet more intense, and he could see the change in the air whenever they were in the same room. One afternoon, Johnson asked Christopher to meet him in his study. Christopher, looking slightly agitated, entered the room, closing the door behind him. "You wanted to talk?" Christopher asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. Johnson studied his son for a long moment. "Christopher, something is off. You and Loretta—" He trailed off, not wanting to outright accuse him, but his eyes betrayed his concern. Christopher shifted uncomfortably under his father's gaze. "What do you mean?" Johnson sighed, sitting back in his chair. "I don't know what's going on between you two, but I can feel it. I can see it. This tension, this connection, it's not normal." Christopher's heart raced. He had feared this moment would come. His father, always perceptive, was finally starting to put the pieces together. But he couldn't tell him the truth. Not yet. "It's nothing, Dad," Christopher said quickly, his voice a little too sharp. "I don't know what you think you're seeing, but it's not what you think." Johnson raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "I hope you're right, Christopher. I really do. But don't make the same mistakes I made. Don't let anything come between this family." Christopher nodded stiffly, his throat tight. He couldn't bring himself to respond, the weight of his father's words hanging over him. As he left the study, Christopher couldn't help but wonder if his father had figured it out. His anxiety grew with each passing day, and he knew the time was coming when the truth would have to be revealed. At home, the atmosphere between Christopher and Loretta was strained. Their stolen moments had become fewer, the guilt they felt overwhelming. The tension between them had begun to bleed into every aspect of their lives. at work, at home, even during their brief encounters outside. Despite this, their emotional connection remained undeniable. Every time they were in the same room, their eyes would meet, and the unspoken understanding between them would flare to life. It was as if their hearts were drawn to each other, regardless of the consequences. One evening, as they sat across from each other in the kitchen, the silence felt heavy. Loretta was preparing dinner, her movements stiff and mechanical. Christopher, seated at the counter, watched her carefully, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. "Loretta, we need to talk," Christopher said suddenly, his voice low. She glanced up from the stove, her expression unreadable. "About what?" Christopher stood up, walking over to her. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder, his fingers lingering for a moment longer than necessary. "About us." Loretta's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. She turned to face him, her heart pounding. "Christopher, we can't—" "I know," he interrupted, his voice desperate, "but I can't stop thinking about you, Loretta. Every day, every moment, it's like I'm drowning in this. I can't pretend anymore." Loretta's heart ached. She had been trying to push him away, to bury her feelings. But every time she saw him, every time he spoke to her, the connection between them grew stronger. She had always known there was something about him, something magnetic, but now it was too much to ignore. "I don't know what we're doing, Christopher," she whispered, tears threatening to spill. "This is wrong. This whole thing. It's all wrong." Christopher cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away a tear. "I don't care, Loretta. I just want you." Their lips met again, this time more urgently than before. It was as if the kiss was the only thing that made sense in the chaos they had created. They had crossed the point of no return. Johnson's health became so critical that he was rushed to the hospital. Johnson lies on a grand bed at the hospital, his face pale but calm. Machines beep softly, tracking his vitals. Loretta sits by his bedside, holding his frail hand, while Christopher stands at the window, staring out with a conflicted expression.
Johnson weakly calls out, "Loretta, Christopher, come closer."
Loretta looks at Christopher, signaling him to approach. Reluctantly, he leaves the window and moves to the other side of the bed.
"Johnson, I've spent my life building a legacy, but in the end, what matters is family." He pauses, catching his breath. "I've made mistakes, but my intentions were always to protect both of you, both of..."
Loretta's eyes well up, and she grips Mr. Johnson's hand tighter. Christopher looks down, guilt flickering in his eyes.
Loretta softly, "You've done so much for us, Johnson. Please rest." Johnson shaking his head.
"Not yet. I want you both to look after each other and be there for each other. The secret of every family is the bond of love." Christopher, strained. "Dad, don't talk like that. You're not going anywhere." Johnson smiles faintly, his gaze softening as he looks at his son. Johnson continues, "Christopher, you've grown more than I thought possible. Take care of her. And yourself." His breathing grows shallow and his hand slackens in Loretta's grip. The beeping from the machine slows until it becomes one long, continuous tone.
Loretta gasps, tears streaming down her face. Christopher clenches his fists, his jaw tightening as he struggles to contain his emotions. Loretta, whispering, "He's gone."
Loretta sits on a couch, her eyes red from crying. Christopher stands stiffly beside her, trying to maintain a stoic demeanor as guests offer their condolences. At their residence, the family matriarch, Johnson's sister, begins to address the mourners.
"Family head. It's a great loss. Johnson was a pillar of this family, this community, but his legacy lives on in you, Christopher."
Christopher nods mechanically, his mind elsewhere. Across the room, whispers circulate about the unusual dynamics of the family.
A guest, Madam Comfort, whispering, "Did you hear? The CEO married his secretary. Strange, isn't it?" Another guest, Madam Judith, "So strange. Yes, I heard of it, but he must have had his reasons. That man never did anything without a plan."
Loretta overhears the murmurs and shifts uncomfortably, guilt and unease clouding her expression. She glances at Christopher, who avoids her gaze. The room grows silent as the family matriarch stands to address the crowd.
Johnson's sister addressing the people. Thank you all for coming to honor my brother Johnson. He was a man of vision, strength, and heart. We will hold a formal memorial service later, but for now, let us remember him with love and respect. After the funeral, one day Loretta received a call from Johnson's lawyer. He had scheduled a meeting with her to discuss some legal matters regarding of Mr. Cole's will. Loretta's heart sank as she made her way to the lawyer's office, her mind racing with dread.
When she arrived, the lawyer handed her an envelope sealed with Johnson's signature. Inside, she found a letter and a video recording. The letter was brief but to the point. Loretta, if you are reading this, then I am no longer here. I want you to watch the video with Christopher. It's time for both of you to understand why I married you and what I hope to achieve. Don't be afraid to face the truth. It's the only way to heal this family. Loretta's hands shook as she held the envelope. She felt her stomach twist, her thoughts spiraling. What had Johnson known? What had he planned? That evening, Loretta and Christopher sat together in the living room, the video player in front of them. Neither of them spoke as the recording began. Loretta and Christopher sit side by side on a leather couch. Christopher hesitates before pressing play on the video file labeled "For Christopher and Loretta." The screen flickers to life, and Johnson appears, seated in the very study they're in now.
Johnson on video. If you're watching this, it means I'm no longer with you.
Loretta shifts nervously, while Christopher leans forward, his eyes fixed on the screen.
Johnson from the video. I know the two of you have had your differences, plenty of them, but I saw something in both of you that neither of you could see in yourselves.
He pauses, his expression serious.
Johnson, still talking from the video. Christopher, you needed grounding, focus, and someone to challenge you to be better. Loretta, you needed someone to show you that love and partnership could be found in the most unexpected places. That's why I married Loretta, to prepare both of you for what's to come.
Christopher and Loretta exchange shocked glances, their breathing shallow.
Johnson, on video. You're not just my family. You're my hope for this company and for the legacy I've built. But you need to work together, not against each other. Find common ground, forgive past mistakes, and move forward as partners.
I married Loretta and have never touched her as my wife. I know a day will come that you will have desire for each other. I married you, Loretta, not out of love, but out of necessity. When I first met you, I saw a woman who could help me protect my son, a woman who could be a mother, a sister, and a wife to him when I could not. Christopher, for all his intelligence, has always been reckless, selfish, and blind to what truly matters. I knew that only you could help him see the truth. Loretta's eyes widened, her chest tightening. She glanced at Christopher, who was visibly shaken. I married you because I saw in you the strength and wisdom to guide Christopher. Johnson, still on video. Christopher, I noticed all your relationship moves, both from your first kiss till when you get down with each other. Loretta has never lied to me once, but the day her expression were filled with lies, I knew she had crossed the line. But that was the lie I have wished to hear from her. Is so fortunate that my will was to both of you as a couple and not individual. After watching the video, the lawyer will present you with the will. I wish you both best of luck in your new-found life. The video ends, leaving the room in heavy silence. Loretta clasps her hands tightly in her lap, while Christopher exhales sharply, running a hand through his hair. Christopher softly said he knew everything. Loretta said, and he still trusted us to make it right. Is that why he never let me be in his bed? He always give me excuses each time I want to be in bed with him. That's what led me to. She cut her speech. They both sit in silence, the weight of Johnson's final words sinking in. Their dynamic has shifted yet again, but this time, there's an unspoken understanding between them. Days after watching the video were some of the hardest of Loretta and Christopher's lives. The truth, so carefully hidden by Johnson, had unraveled everything they had believed about their relationship. The foundation of their lives had been shaken to its core. And now, the task before them was almost too much to bear. Reconcile the past, face the present, and move forward, knowing the unthinkable bond they shared. For the first time in weeks, Loretta and Christopher spoke to each other openly. The weight of their silence had been crushing, but now the floodgates had opened. As the days passed, their conversations were filled with questions, regrets, and newfound understanding. Loretta had never imagined that her marriage to Johnson, one built on obligation and the belief that she could help guide his son, would lead to such a complicated web of emotions. She had, for so long, seen Christopher as a spoiled, reckless young man, someone who was too lost in his own desires to care for anyone else. But the truth was, Johnson had been right. Christopher needed someone, and it was Loretta who had the strength to teach him what truly mattered: family, responsibility, and love. But how could they reconcile the twisted path they had walked? How could they erase the stains of their past mistakes? One evening, Loretta found herself in the same kitchen where Christopher had kissed her months ago. It felt like a lifetime ago, yet the emotions were still fresh, still raw. She was preparing dinner when Christopher entered, his face more tired than usual. There was something different in the air between them, no longer filled with tension, but a deep, unspoken understanding. "I've been thinking," Christopher began, his voice uncertain, "about everything we've done, everything we've been through. I don't know what the future holds, but I can't pretend that nothing happened." He paused, then added softly, "And neither can you." Loretta turned around, her heart pounding. She didn't know if she was ready to face him, to face their feelings head on, but she knew they had to do it. The truth had already changed them, and there was no going back. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her eyes meeting his. "I never wanted any of this. I never imagined that I would find myself here, with you, Christopher. But we can't keep pretending it didn't happen." Christopher stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "Then what do we do now? How do we fix this?" Loretta swallowed hard. "We start by accepting that things can't go back to the way they were. We have to move forward, together, and figure out what that means. It's going to be difficult, but we owe it to ourselves, and to Johnson, to try." Christopher nodded, his expression one of quiet determination. "I don't know how we do this, but I want to try. I want to make things right." The next day, they gathered for what was the most difficult conversation of all. It wasn't just the two of them anymore. It was the entire family. Christopher and Loretta had decided that they needed to be honest with everyone, to let them know the truth, even if it meant risking everything they had. When they sat down with the rest of the family, the air was thick with anticipation. Johnson's absence left a void that could never be filled, but it also made the moment more charged with emotion. Each of them was unsure how to react, how to accept the truth they had been forced to confront. "I know this is difficult for all of you," Christopher began, his voice shaky but strong. "But Loretta and I—" He stopped himself, gathering his thoughts. "We've been through a lot, and the truth is, we've been hiding from it for too long. We both made mistakes, and now we need to face the consequences." Loretta's hands trembled in her lap as she spoke next. "We owe it to you, to Johnson's memory, to be honest. We're not asking for forgiveness, but we need you to understand that this, whatever this is between Christopher and I, it happened because we were both lost. We were both searching for something that we didn't know how to find, and now we have to find a way to move forward, together." The room was silent. No one knew how to respond, not at first. But eventually, it was Johnson's sister, the family matriarch, who spoke up. She was the first to break the silence. "You both have a lot of work to do," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "But we all make mistakes. The important thing now is to show the world that you can make things right, for yourselves, for Johnson's legacy." The family didn't fully understand, and some were still too hurt to forgive, but they could see the genuine remorse in Loretta and Christopher's eyes. Slowly, they began to accept that the path to healing wasn't going to be easy, but it was possible. As the weeks passed, Loretta and Christopher worked tirelessly to rebuild their lives. They couldn't undo what had been done, but they could start anew, slowly and carefully. They agreed to take things one step at a time, not rushing into anything, but learning to trust each other again. Christopher moved into his own apartment, which allowed him some space to breathe. The tension between him and Loretta started to ease, and they began to spend time together again, only this time, it was different. They were no longer driven by forbidden attraction. Instead, they sought a quiet, steady friendship that would eventually grow into something stronger, more genuine. They took long walks in the park, went to the movies together, and even shared quiet dinners at their favorite restaurant. But this time, there was no rush, no burning desire to escape the weight of their emotions. Instead, they focused on rebuilding the foundation of their relationship: honesty, trust, and a shared vision of the future. Months later, when the wounds had started to heal and their lives were moving forward, Loretta and Christopher decided to visit Johnson's grave. It had been a long and difficult journey, but they had come to a place where they could accept the truth. As they stood at the grave, the wind blowing gently through the trees, Loretta placed a single white rose on the tombstone. "I'm sorry, Johnson," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted any of this, but we're trying. We're trying to make things right." Christopher stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "We'll make you proud, Dad," he said softly, his voice full of emotion. "We'll find our way." And with that, they stood in silence, knowing that the road ahead would be challenging, but they had the strength to face it, together. The workplace was abuzz with whispers and stolen glances as the news of Christopher and Loretta's relationship spread across the whole building. For weeks, their affair had been the subject of hushed conversations and sly grins among their colleagues, but when their impending marriage became public knowledge, the office exploded with speculation. Christopher, once known as the reckless playboy who had a different woman on his arm every week, had become a man transformed. His demeanor shifted to one of quiet confidence, and his focus on the company's goals became razor-sharp. He no longer showed up late or missed meetings, and his interactions with Loretta, now his fiancée, were professional but tinged with an undeniable warmth. Loretta, too, carried herself with grace and composure, though she couldn't help but notice the sidelong glances from her peers. Some of her co-workers were supportive, while others couldn't hide their judgment. But Loretta had long learned to rise above gossip. She was focused on her work and on building a future with Christopher. Their relationship, though unconventional and born out of chaos, had blossomed into something genuine. At work, they maintained clear boundaries, avoiding overt displays of affection during office hours. However, their chemistry was palpable, and everyone could see that the dynamic duo was now aligned, both in their personal lives and in their professional pursuits. When the day of their wedding arrived, it was nothing short of a spectacle. The event was held at one of the city's most luxurious venues, with dignitaries, celebrities, and industry leaders in attendance. The wedding was a grand celebration with modern sophistication. Loretta wore a breathtaking white gown adorned with intricate diamond stones, while Christopher looked dashing in a custom-tailored tuxedo. The ceremony was emotional, with heartfelt vows that brought tears to the eyes of everyone present. The couple promised to support and cherish one another, acknowledging the trials they had faced and the love that had grown from them. As they exchanged rings, the crowd erupted in applause, and the newlyweds shared a kiss that symbolized not just their love, but also their resilience. The reception was an unforgettable affair, with live music, dances, and speeches from loved ones that celebrated their journey. The highlight of the evening was a surprise video tribute to Johnson, played on a massive screen. The video, compiled from family memories, reminded everyone of the late CEO's wisdom and love for his family. Loretta and Christopher stood hand in hand as they watched, tears streaming down their faces. They knew that Johnson's dream for them had finally come true. Returning to the office as husband and wife was an adjustment for both Christopher and Loretta, but they embraced it with grace. The power dynamic between them had shifted. They were now equals, partners in life and in business. Their shared vision for the company became a driving force, and their complementary skills brought new energy to the workplace. Their colleagues quickly adapted to the new normal. While some joked about the office power couple, most respected the boundaries Christopher and Loretta had set. They kept their personal lives separate from their professional roles, focusing on growing the company and fostering a positive work environment. Loretta, as poised as ever, continued to lead by example, mentoring junior staff and ensuring that the company culture remained inclusive and supportive. Christopher, with his newfound maturity, worked hard to earn the respect of his peers, proving that he was more than just the CEO's son. Together, they became a formidable team, inspiring everyone around them. Though their journey had been anything but conventional, Christopher and Loretta found a rhythm that worked for them. They learned to navigate the complexities of their relationship with honesty and understanding, turning their past mistakes into lessons for the future. At work, they were a dynamic force, driving the company to new heights. At home, they built a life filled with love, laughter, and mutual respect. Their story, once marred by controversy and chaos, became a testament to the power of forgiveness and the strength of true partnership. Years later, as they sat together in the garden of their home, watching their children play, Christopher turned to Loretta with a smile. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Loretta laughed softly, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We have, and I wouldn't change a thing." Their love story, though unconventional, had become the fairy tale neither of them had expected. And as they gazed at the setting sun, they knew that the best was yet to come. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe to be able to get our update when we post a new video. Thank you for your support.